Hello, everybody. I'm Jason
Hello.
Snell. He's Dan Morin. We're your Six Colors crew to talk about our two favorite things: money and charts about money.
Oh, I was really hoping it was just money and more money.
That's why they call it money.
Reference acknowledged.
Apple first quarter, which is, of course, the holiday quarter, but fiscally it's the first quarter of 2024. Results are out. And, as always, we talk about the dichotomy between the how's a business doing and I'm an investor and I want to see growth. But by a
Growth.
how's my business doing, this was the second most profitable and second biggest revenue quarter Apple has ever had.
Just a little quarter. Just
That's
a
how they're
small thing.
doing.
It's a little thing.
It was small amount of growth, but after what 5 quarters of not growing the business year over year. So from that perspective, but we got charts about all that too.
We got charts.
You have any top line
Here.
things that you'd like to mention, Dan?
Um, it should not surprise anybody that the weaknesses in like where this product line, like where the weaknesses were. I think the other thing, the most important to note, which they themselves were not shy of noting, there was an additional week in
Right.
last year's quarter. So even though they were kind of, flat to slightly up, their point is repeatedly in this that if this had been the same number of weeks, we would have been, solid, like good, not like great, but like,
Yeah,
up,
it's
no
actually
question.
when you're doing the year over year quarterly compare, it's actually it would look better.
Yeah.
So, which is actually, I mean, that's not bad, right? Like they were still up in most places, despite having one fewer week of sales.
Yeah.
Sometimes they use that as the
Exactly.
excuse for why it's a bad quarter, but this time they're like,
Right.
look how much better it would have been.
Yeah. You're always gonna, this is the rule. It's always whatever favors you the most.
Yes, undoubtedly. Well, should we look at charts?
Let's look at some charts.
Okay, it's very exciting. Let's start with the Mac revenue, a classic chart.
Happy 40th birthday, Mac.
Um, well, I mean, so the Mac revenue, 7.8 billion, is pretty good, right? Like
Good. Solid.
they didn't used to have those kind of quarters before 4 or 5 years ago
Yeah. It's not the tremendous growth that we saw
for a
in
couple of
the,
years in there.
the
Yeah,
pandemic slash Apple Silicon transition, which was a really a 1-2 punch for them.
yeah,
But like we're back to slightly better than we were doing before that, essentially.
yeah. I mean, at that number, and if I move over to the change slide, which is what lots of people care about. It was 1% up, but if you look at the previous quarters, they were down year over year 29, 31, 7, and 34%. So the Mac kind of flattening out is music to Apple's ears because there were a
Yeah.
lot of down
Oh,
years after that. Again, the number was set so high in 2020 and into 2021.
look at that 70% growth, right, in 2021.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
yeah. I mean,
Exactly.
again, and I think probably the M3 lineup debuting last quarter helped give them a little bit of a bump back into the
Yeah, I
positive
think
growth
that's
there.
what got it back to flat. But it is, it's good to see the Mac back in its, back in the positive territory, and also sort of trying to find what I always say about this stuff. I said this about the iPad when it had its big downturn and then kind of came back up. Is you're trying to find
Save
like
that thought, Jason.
what's the well, we'll get there. What's the level? That's that like what is this business? And I think that we could all probably agree, if I go back to that previous slide, that the Mac is probably not gonna, at least at this point, right, like in the next couple of quarters, it's not going to settle in at what is the record, like almost $11 billion a quarter. Like that's not going to happen. But what is the number? Is it the
Right.
old number, where it's around six per quarter, which was before that big peak, or is it more like 7.5 billion per quarter? And I think that's probably it, right? They keep talking about their install base being bigger than ever. You would see that even if people have bought a lot of Macs and aren't going to be buying more Macs for a little while, with the install base increasing, you would expect that there would be, you'd just be at a little higher level than you were before, which is, I sort of think where they are for their 40-year-old product.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a respectable place to be.
All right, let's look at the iPad then. It's people talking about charts. iPad revenue. Um, no iPad came out
Yeah.
last year. So, honestly, that they sold $7
It did
billion
okay.
in year plus old iPads is not that bad.
You need an
Um,
iPad, you're going to buy an iPad, right?
yeah, that's right. And how seasonal is it? I mean, we can see from this chart that it's not
Yeah, you
super
get a little bit.
seasonal.
Yeah.
It had a really good holiday quarter last year, but
Yeah.
in general, it's not as seasonal as some of other Apple's product categories. It had its best of the last four quarters, which you would kind of expect for the holiday quarter, but Q2 was only 300 million less. Um, Talking about this money like it's play money. Anyway, it's the iPad is also like the Mac coming off a high, and if we move over to the
This
revenue
the
change,
the revenue change chart is a trip for the iPad, right? Because the iPad has
yeah,
literally had its ups and downs. I mean,
and
it
it's yeah,
all over the place. That one holiday quarter really was a nice jump for them, but it was an aberration growth wise in the
well,
last.
right. They had that great growth expansion again, sort of in the pandemic, and then their holiday quarter of 22, so holiday 21 was a crash down because it was so high the year before.
Yeah,
And
and
then the holiday quarter last year shot up because the one was so low that it went up 30%, and this year
yeah.
they're like, yeah, we can't keep that up, back down to
So
sort of where
I
it
think
was
the
before.
the other interesting thing to know about that, and of course this is only showing us a growth for the last, few years.
Yeah.
The important thing to remember about the iPad is, and we've been through this before, is like the replacement cycle is long. So a ton of people bought iPads during the pandemic thinking this is perfect for being at home or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And those iPads will continue serving them for a while. You added a lot of new customers there, but those people are not going to buy new iPads in a year or 2 years or
No.
whatever. So I would honestly, I will be interested to see if in like 2 more years we might see a little bit of a bump again as all those
Sure.
pandemic iPads start phasing out. But this is the story of the iPad is that it is a it is a strange product. It does not have it's a decent sized business, like you said, reliable at that 7 million level or so. Like that's not bad, but
Yeah.
it's not a growth business in the
I
way it
mean,
was in those early days.
25 billion a year is a pretty good business to be in. But the initial growth
I'll
was
take it.
huge, and then there was the huge pandemic spurt,
Yeah.
and now we're back in sort of the doldrums. But
Yeah.
I think
Plus
that's
plus no iPads, as we said,
I
which
yeah I think again I want to emphasize I think it's actually kind of amazing that they sold $7 billion
yeah.
in iPads, given that no new iPad models have been announced for a year.
Mm-hmm. It's
All
not
right,
nothing.
iPhone revenue. This is of course the big one. This was the second biggest. I mean, I said it was the second biggest Apple quarter ever. It stands to reason then that it's the second biggest iPhone quarter ever, and indeed it was. Only that holiday quarter 22, which was calendar holidays 21, with 71.6 billion, but 69.7 billion,
Spitting
a
distance.
pretty good. And you can see how seasonal this business is. And people who are concerned about growth will note that the iPhone growth has slowed quite a lot.
Yeah.
Apple keeps talking about its success in other markets, in developing markets. And I think that that's the truth, is that they've got a lot of saturation in some of their most developed markets. They still do well. They said, we're top, four of the top five in these countries and four of the
All
top
right.
six in these countries. And
Australia, I think
in
every single
Australia,
iPhone. Yeah.
they are the top five.
Yeah. Good for
Um,
them.
but they
Throw
did
another
say that
iPhone on the Barbie.
there was huge growth in some other markets, including
The,
Latin America
and
and parts of the Middle East and other parts of Asia, and that's where they're getting the
you mentioned
growth that they
the
see.
seasonality too, and I mean, it is also because Apple. This is the Apple product that gets released like clockwork every year, right? The iPads don't get really updated every year. The Macs do, but it's kind of whenever, right? Like the iPhone is like clockwork. It is in September. with that one exception
Yeah,
of the year that they couldn't ship it because of the pandemic.
yeah.
But like basically it's every September. So you're always going to see that big holiday quarter bump.
And you can see it here.
It's well positioned.
You can
Yeah.
see the tick. And in fact, for 21, you can actually see the tick of 22 where they drew some sales forward.
Yeah.
Here's the growth or the revenue change chart just to see again 21 fiscal massive growth, then mostly single digits, then the last 4 quarters kind of up and down but just not much. This is a 6%,
A little better.
not blowing you away, but also the most in 5 quarters. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's analysts who are probably happy about that, but it's not. They beat the expectation, is my understanding. So sometimes it's an expectations game. Let's talk about services. I had somebody ask me today, why don't I have the black line for the 4 quarter moving average? I actually had a conversation 3 months ago with one of the people I talked to about our charts on a regular basis, who suggested that services is not a seasonal business and probably doesn't deserve a rolling average. And I kind of agree. So there's no black line here because the bars are the black line, because services just kind of keeps rolling, and
Right.
it doesn't you don't buy a service 1 quarter and then drop it, and like that doesn't happen
Not yet
in this
anyways,
business.
but yeah.
It is, well, yeah, I mean, just the nature
There's
of
a
it.
little bit of churn, but
There's
yeah,
churn, but
it's
it's
not
never
the same.
it's
No.
not like buying iPhones. So I kind of took it out because I think it's just doubling what we're already seeing here to do that
Yeah.
black
Which
line.
is steady up, few dips last in 2022, a little bit of dip there. But again, you look at that trend line and it's very clearly up and up and up and up.
Yeah. Well, you can't look at the trend line because I took it out, but I get your
But
point.
like you can envision.
Well, yeah, and when I switch over to revenue change, this is the thing. Even when there are dips, they weren't dips year over year, because they
Right.
have not had a down year over year in
Yeah,
this category.
they've had a couple down sequential quarters, but
Exactly, but that's about it. So
yeah.
here, if you look again, actually kind of progress up 11%. Last quarter, they were 16% year over year after a kind of 4 quarter span when they were gasp down in the single digit growth category for this category. But this is, now keep in mind that worth the disclaimer, this is not just Apple TV Plus and Apple Music. This is also App Store. And apparently also Google paying them billions of dollars for search engine referrals.
Which
this
is we understand it is of like a flat amount, right? That they're getting paid by Google, or at least
I'm
it's not. It's
unclear
not. Yeah,
on whether
it sounded
it's a flat
like
amount or
based,
whether it's based on the number of searches that come in from Safari. I'm unclear on that.
Seems like it's a very consistent amount, if nothing else. So it provides you with that base level like revenue every time, and then you got some play on top of it from all those other services: iCloud, Apple Care, App Store, etc.
And one of the things that is worth noting about services as well is how profitable they are. So for this quarter, products, so what we think of as, I am like people tomorrow maybe receiving a piece of hardware from Apple in exchange for cash. Products gross margin last quarter was 39.4%, which is actually way up. And 39% profit margin, pretty
It's a
sweet.
good profit. We talk a lot about Apple protecting its profit margins, and that's why. Because when you make
That's
almost 40% on every product, you make a lot
on
of
average,
money, and they're
on
not
every
cheap
product they sell.
products. Yeah.
They said, driven by leverage and mix, partially offset by foreign exchange. But here's the point. So that's 39.4%, pretty good. The margin on services was 72.8. And that is partially because you make a TV show and and then you can scale it sort of infinitely, and the TV show only has to be made once. But what it really is making Google your default browser costs nothing.
Yep. That's free money. That's all upside.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also say probably taking 30% of purchases in the App Store, the cost to run the App Store is probably not anywhere near the 30% that they're taking. Right.
As as Europe may or may not
EC,
agree with.
European Commission coming in on my headphones here now, maybe. Anyway, very, very, very profitable category, services.
There's a reason that they have invested so much time and energy in this, and especially with all the concerns about, can the iPhone grow forever? The answer is no, because nothing grows forever. But services certainly is a good candidate to keep the bulwark sort of, in your business while you're dealing with all these other ups and downs of your other product lines.
I'm gonna jump. I'm jumping around in charts here because I've got some charts that are out of order. I'm gonna show wearables, home, and accessories next. This is 12 billion. Pretty good if you think of it that way, but if you see the 4-quarter rolling average trend line, this is a business that was for a while going up, up, up like services, but has peaked. And you can really see it in the year-over-year change where, again, enormous growth through early 2022. And since then, they have been down year-over-year all but 1 quarter. Now,
it's a weird business of all of them.
So the AirPods has been quiet. The home business is non-existent, like HomePods or whatever. And the Apple Watch has not really changed a lot. I mean, the Ultra, it got introduced, and I think that's probably why there was some growth at any point. But I mean, it's not. This is a business that expanded to a point and is now just sort of like contracting back a little bit. I mean, the Vision Pro will contribute something to this, but I doubt it will be an enormous amount.
Revenue is probably good because you are selling high cost products, but you're not selling a lot of them. And your profit margins are probably, I mean, they're good because, as we just said, Apple protects their profit margins, but they're also not probably as high as some of their other profit margins because this is a very expensive product to build. Profit. That's your old. But yeah, it's a weird business, right? Because so many things are lumped into this category. This isn't just like Mac, iPad, iPhone, right? Yeah, we know what all those things are. This is the other.
In fact, I got to take it out because it's scrolled off now. But until just before this chart starts, this was other.
It was other.
This was the other category.
It's also worth noting, as I think they did in the call, they had new AirPods the previous year.
Yeah, I guess so. It's a quote unquote tough compare.
Yeah, but it is also. I agree with you. I think there's only so much. Like once you have a pair of AirPods, you don't buy 4 pairs of AirPods.
They built out this category. I think they're hoping that the Vision Pro will eventually provide some traction here. It might throw a billion to the line next quarter. It might. Probably not, but somewhere 800,000 or 800 million.
I mean, you could do the back of the envelope math, right? If they're selling 200,000 units at $3,500 a pop.
Yeah, and it's probably more than that for total revenue in that category.
Right. I mean, because you're talking accessories.
That's what I did. Is I did 200,000 times 4,000, and what you get is 800 million.
Yeah, I was going to say conservatively, you're close to $1 billion there.
Yeah,
pretty
easily, so maybe.
That's not a huge, right? 12 billion, right? This year in this quarter in profits.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's the point. Is if they
nice,
sell,
but it's
if
not
they do an amazing job selling a very expensive product and selling a lot of it, it's the difference between saying that this category is 9.3 or 10.2,
right? And is down 11% or is like down 5%.
Yeah, so something to watch, but I don't think the Vision Pro is going to ride to the rescue in the near term in this category. More big changes to Apple Watch, new home products, new AirPods. Yeah. There are other things that could drive this, I think, more. Okay, let's look at the green charts. So I have a total Apple revenue chart. This is the big one that everybody looks at. That is second biggest ever, 119.6 billion. Of course, their business is very seasonal, which is why the black line is there as well. You can see that it's sort of like, and in this case, I think this is good news. It depends on your perspective, but what you see here so often happens with Apple, which is they have a surge of growth. And then the question is, do they come down off that surge, or does that surge of growth sort of level out into a new normal? And I think what you see here is that the surge of growth that happened has sort of leveled out, where even though the growth overall is not pleasing Wall Street necessarily, what they didn't do is give it back. So they're now up at levels where even last year's disappointing, quote unquote, holiday quarter was the second largest of all time, eclipsed now by this quarter. So Apple has sort of like built a new level for themselves, which again is not the growth that some people are demanding, but it's also not what you see with something like the Mac and the iPad, where they're giving it back essentially and kind of receding to a level that is before the, sort of like what it was like in 2019, 2018.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here's the profit number, which people don't talk about as much, but it helps to be profitable. That's where the margin goes. Throwing off another $34 billion in cash because I can.
Yeah. Tough life.
And here's the margin numbers, just because it's kind of fun. The gross margin for the whole company, a record.
Yeah, interesting. I remember very much from my time covering this at Macworld when we used to do our live financial call coverage. The gross margin pretty much always hovered around 38%. You get a couple points, like maybe a point or a couple fractions of a point up or down. But like you were just talking about plateaus, you go to a new plateau, right? And you can kind of see this here. Well, I think this is an interesting way of looking at it. Like there's a little flat plateau to about 2021, and it goes up, and it kind of flattens out again, and now it's kind of on the upswing
Going
again.
up again.
Yeah, and 45%, in 2-3 years, they have increased their gross margin by 7 points. That's a lot.
Yeah, and this is, again, I think this is why the service business is so important to them, is not only does it provide them growth, but it provides them margin. And the margin, like if you think about it, services growth is good. It throws off growing amounts of revenue, which is good, and it's more profitable, profit-wise, which means that more of it falls to the bottom line, which means more bottom line growth, which is what Wall Street wants to see. So it's a smart move in that way.
It's a good way to keep them happy.
Well, you can see this is why this is why they're playing hardball with the EU, is because that's a bunch of very profitable revenue that's in the services category. So I understand it. Here's the year-over-year revenue change for total Apple, and 2%. Not like super exciting, but again, 4 straight quarters of not.
Plus an extra week last year. So again, if you adjust, you probably get to go up a little bit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, when you have four quarters where you have had negative growth.
Yeah.
Growth.
Let's look at the pie. Now we're in the relative size of Apple's categories. For people who were wondering, they did actually confirm today that Vision Pro is going to be a wearables category thing, because you put it on your face, you wear it.
It's not an iPhone. It's not a Mac. It's not an iPad. It's not a service.
No,
they're not interested in adding new. They're not interested in adding new categories.
No, legally, if at some point you have to break it out into its own category, but I think it's going to be a while. So.
It's going to be so small for a while that I think it's unlikely.
Yeah, well, like Apple Watch, right? It's not its own category because it doesn't need to be. iPhone introduction quarter, the iPhone slice of the pie swells that quarter, right? Because it was, I think, last quarter 52 or 51 or something like that, up to 58 this time. But just so we're clear, we show those charts and they all look the same. But the iPhone is not the same. The iPhone is much larger than those other categories. 6 and 7% for the Mac, 10% for wearables. Services coming along, almost to 20%. Mm-hmm. But that's the size of the iPhone business. The iPhone business is, 10 times the size of the iPad business, essentially. And then I have another chart that is just the 100% chart, so you can see all the blue. That means that the iPhone is very important to Apple, and the seasonality, that means that this is the kind of quarter where it's an enormous percentage of the chart. This stuff hasn't really changed a lot over time. There was a period where services was growing and expanding, but now it's just sort of got its chunk is not as dramatically different this time than it has been in the past.
It's pretty consistent. I mean, you look at the beginning, the beginning of your chart and the end of your chart. Yeah, there's some dips in there, but you look at that thickness of that section is pretty consistent throughout.
Yeah, and obviously the iPhone seasonality is the thing that's giving services the shape on the top. That's about the iPhone. What else do I have here? I have some regional revenue. These are the moving averages, so seasonality is taken out, and you can just see sort of America is kind of flat, a little bit up. Europe and the Middle East and Africa up a bit. China down a bit. Rest of Asia Pacific up, basically flat, and Japan basically flat.
Yeah. So decent. I mean, aside from China, they were good in pretty much every geographic
Yeah, and
area this quarter.
I've
So
got a China breakout chart, but one more. This is the year over year growth um,
yeah,
by
that tells an interesting
region.
does tell an interesting story, especially on the China front there, right? Because you can see China, you've had some big jumps in China, but it's, doesn't always have staying power. Because again, like with some, I mean, a lot of that falls into sort of peaks of demand,
Yeah.
as we saw with the 2021 business.
You can also see that Apple's business really in this chart is a worldwide business. There are occasionally things that happen that are like aberrations, like that one quarter where China sales was way down, which I
Mhm.
think was because of like closures and stuff like that because of COVID.
Yeah.
But mostly the sales track. Like
Yeah.
mostly stuff goes up and down. This quarter, China, last 2 quarters, China has been down. America's a little more flat, and the European segment a little bit up. But generally, they track. Here's the China chart just to see. People are always eyeing China. There's a lot of tough competition in China. Apple actually sort of said that the iPhone did pretty well in China, and that it was some of the other categories, which again, it's going to be the weakness with Mac and iPad and wearables more than it is the iPhone that's actually hitting this category. But also they had that period of inflationary growth and they're kind of coming off of it. They're not still growing 20% a quarter in China.
Right. I mean, they had an opportunity there where it was a market they hadn't
Right.
really tapped into. And once you've tapped into that market, you can't tap
Yeah.
into it
And
again.
and headwinds, I think they mentioned the headwinds in Chinese currency too. Um they're always going to have a story, but certainly for some people looking at this will be a red flag about people who are worried about Apple in China. I don't know. Every time I hear people worried about Apple in China, it seems to turn around. I think it's I think you
You
can
know,
maybe get too
the,
worried
the
about it.
truth of it, Jason, is in China, it's always a red flag.
That's the end of the charts. That's it. No more
Um,
charts, Dan.
no more charts. That's fair.
This is
The
you. You
thing,
did this.
I did this. The thing that I found most interesting, I was kind of listening with one ear to the call as I was making dinner, but I did think Tim Cook wanted to talk about AI.
Yes. Yes.
Boy,
I That's one of the notes that I have written down is, and I'm going to write something
there
about it
were
a
a
little bit
couple
later.
moments. Yeah, there
The
were a couple
AI
moments.
insecurity. Let me give you the quote. He said, "As we look ahead, we will continue to invest in these and other technologies that will shape the future. That includes, nobody asked, this is in his statement, that includes artificial intelligence, where we continue to spend a tremendous amount of time and effort, and we're excited to share the details of our ongoing work in that space later this year." That is an intention to announce a product. That is an actual future tease. And of course, several analysts then asked him about it.
He's like, I
Um,
already told you.
but
What
what he
else do you
did
want to
say,
know?
I have one other quote from him, which is, um, in terms of generative AI, we have a lot of work going on internally, as I've alluded to before. Our MO, if you will, I enjoyed that. He paused, like, what am I going to call it? Our MO, if you will, like we're a criminal, has always been to do work and then talk about work and not to get out in front of ourselves. And so we're going to hold that to this as well. But we've got some things that we're incredibly excited about that we'll be talking about later this year. Didn't really
Yeah,
say anything, but like unprompted was like, oh, by the way, we have a lot of things coming with AI, so don't get mad at us.
yeah. I mean, he talked about that, and then he mentioned like a little bit later. I thought that was interesting. He mentioned since the introduction of Apple Silicon in 2020, we've been proud to offer our users unmatched performance and power. And so, what else do you talk about? Along with a remarkable neural engine for artificial
Mm-hmm.
intelligence and machine learning. Got to hit that note right there. Hey,
Yeah,
you don't think we're paying enough attention to this? We have literally built it into our hardware. This is the thing that always gets to me when people say Apple's behind. Is like they have been building that neural engine into their chips for
yeah,
years. You don't spend the valuable, not only time and energy developing it, but the space on your chip is prime real estate. You're not going to devote that much space to it if you are not serious about it.
yeah. Yeah, it's just right. The story's more nuanced. They got caught flat-footed, I think, with the rapid development of large language models.
Yeah.
Um, but by all accounts, including Mark Gurman's, this and now Tim Cook's, I guess, this summer they're going to be, the OS announcements are going to be full of very obvious machine learning things. But also, Apple's been doing machine learning features for a while now. It's just
Yeah.
that now that the pressure's on, they will never stop, including on the call today, never stop from
Talking about it.
calling it out and saying this is machine learning, right? Like, don't forget
The
it.
other part that made me laugh was in continuing to talk about Apple Silicon. He mentions, this empowers users to do more than they ever could before, whether they're making a musical masterpiece using the latest features in Logic Pro or beating their high score in a graphics-intensive game. Reminder: Apple, they're getting
Yeah,
serious about gaming. But what I love about that is like, it feels like Tim tried to run some like A, Tim doesn't know any games, and
no,
B, someone's like, can we mention any games? Like, no, we better not. We should probably just say graphic
games.
intensive
No, yeah,
game.
it was this. That it was a very. I would say it was like a quintessential Apple comment, which is, "Let me give you a very specific media example." And then I don't know. Do you still have high
Games,
scores?
people,
Sure,
yeah.
whatever.
Well, a high scores in Pac-Man.
Yeah, right. In Joust, I was really good. You get the eggs.
So
It's good.
good.
Remember when he referred to Pokemans? This reminded me of that a little bit. The
Oh,
Pokemans.
Tim. Oh, Tim.
Everybody's out there looking for the Pokemans.
Yeah. So I don't know. Those are the things I know
All
that
right.
jumped out at me. I don't know if you had specific ones too that you felt like were
Those are the big ones. There was a line that I liked about the Vision Pro launch where Tim
mhm.
Cook said, "Moments like these are what we live for at Apple. They are why we do what we do." And I thought that was a good encapsulation of the
Yeah.
Apple attitude about the
Yeah,
stuff that they're working on.
they also asked him, I thought was an interesting question, in their perennial attempts to suss out, hey, can we get some more information here? Get a little more color. Um, the analyst question who asked about like of all the products that exist right now, which one do you think the Vision Pro will look like
Right.
performance wise? And Tim's like, "Oh, I love all my
I love
children
all my children
equally."
equally. Exactly my thought. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, that was a good moment. You ain't gonna get this past Tim Cook. Sorry.
I
Nice
like
try.
I like that. Well, I thought that was a really good analyst
It is good.
question in the sense he's like,
It is, yeah.
because what the analysts are trying to do, and I think he even said, "I'm not gonna ask you about future products, but I want to." And the way he framed it was, "Hey, I'm a Wall Street analyst. I'm wondering how Vision Pro is going to do. Can you tell me, is there a model of your existing products that you think it's going to be similar to?" I think that's a good question to ask, and that one could potentially give a good answer to it. I also knew immediately that Tim was going to say, "I love all my children. They're all different. They're all fragile, unique flowers, and we must cultivate them. And we'll see what the
Can't pick a
future
favorite.
holds." But I thought it was
Can't pick
not
a
a bad
favorite.
analyst question,
No,
right?
I
Which is
agree.
like,
I
is it
thought it
going to
was a
be like the iPad where there's going to be a big spike and then it's going to come down and find its way? Is it going to be?
no,
And they're not going to talk about it because what they're not going to do is set any expectations for it.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we always end up with that interesting part where sometimes every once in a while when the iPhone launch falls kind of in a tricky place in the quarter, sometimes they'll mention the opening week performance or something like, oh, we sold all the units we want to sell or something about that. I was kind of curious to see if they said anything even qualitatively about
Yeah,
Vision Pro, but
right?
no, they just talked
Nothing.
about how excited they are for people to get it tomorrow.
Yeah.
In some ways, this is timed very well for them because they get to
They have no data. Oh, and I have no Dan.
they
Dan
can pick
is.
and choose and
Oh,
talk about
there it
whatever
is.
they want.
I lost you for a second there. We all
Yeah,
lost you,
I saw
but
your
you're
blip
back.
there. It's fine. It's fine. Zoom.
That's okay. I'll do it too. So what I was saying was, anyway,
Excellent point.
was that
Yes, I
good?
couldn't
Was
agree
that
more.
good? All right. We're done. Thank you all for watching our charts. We couldn't do it last time because of there were so many conflicts, but we thought we would share the charts with you.
Chart
And
talk.
before we go, if you're not a member of Six Colors, think about it. We would love your support, and we do a podcast every week
Like
where
this, but fewer charts.
there's less video and fewer charts, but still, it's people like it, I think, and it's good, and you should become a member. But this was free on YouTube because we do that sometimes. But until tomorrow when we record our podcast, bye, Dan.
Bye, Jason.